Some people mistake youth for inexperience and foreign accents for incompetence. When Colonel Marcus Webb dismissed Sarah Chen at the Marine Corps Recruitment Center that sunny Tuesday morning, he had no idea the determined young woman standing before him was about to prove herself in a way that would save 300 American lives in the most dangerous mission of the decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Their accent, or their background. It's about what happens when the system fails you 12 times, but you refuse to let failure define your destiny. It's about that moment when everything you've trained for, everything you've sacrificed, comes down to one final opportunity that could change everything. Sarah's journey began 3 years before that fateful Tuesday morning at Camp Pendleton. Fresh out of the University of Edinburgh with a degree in tactical communications and emergency response coordination, she had one dream that burned brighter than anything else: to serve alongside the United States Marines in combat zones where her unique skills could save lives. But the path to that dream was lined with rejection letters, dismissive interviews, and closed doors. 12 times she had applied for specialized positions within Marine units. 12 times she had been told the same thing: "We'll keep your application on file. You don't quite fit what we're looking for. Perhaps you should consider civilian contractor positions instead." Each rejection carried the same underlying message: a young European woman, no matter how qualified, didn't belong in the elite circles of Marine tactical operations. Her accent marked her as an outsider. Her age suggested inexperience. Her gender raised questions about physical capability in high-stress combat situations. What they couldn't see in those sterile interview rooms was the fire that had been burning inside Sarah since she was 15 years old. Growing up in Glasgow, she had watched her older brother James deploy with British forces to Afghanistan. She had seen him come home changed, haunted by the friends he couldn't save because communication breakdowns had left units isolated and vulnerable in hostile territory. That's when Sarah made her promise, not just to her brother, but to every service member who had ever been left behind because of system failures, communication blackouts, or coordination disasters. She would dedicate her life to becoming the bridge between isolated units and the support they desperately needed. While her classmates were planning gap years and casual careers, Sarah was learning 6 different languages, mastering advanced RADIO communication protocols, and studying tactical response coordination with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She trained with former Special Air Service operators, learned desert survival from ex-Foreign Legion instructors, and spent her summers volunteering with international rescue operations in the most challenging environments on Earth. Every skill she acquired, every certification she earned, every sleepless night she spent studying tactical manuals was preparation for one goal: to become the kind of communication specialist who could coordinate life-saving operations when traditional systems failed. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very system she was trying to serve was the same system that kept rejecting her applications. But Sarah had learned something important during those years of preparation. Persistence isn't about being stubborn. It's about being prepared for the moment when opportunity finally presents itself. Have you ever felt like the world was telling you that you don't belong somewhere you know you're meant to be? Drop a comment below if you've ever had to prove yourself against impossible odds. Sarah's 13th application was different. This time, she wasn't applying for a standard position. Marine intelligence had identified a critical need for a communication specialist who could coordinate with NATO forces during a joint operation in a region where traditional communication infrastructure had been completely compromised. They needed someone who could speak multiple languages, understand diverse military protocols, and most importantly, someone who could think creatively under pressure when standard procedures failed. On paper, Sarah Chen was exactly what they needed. But as she walked through the gates of Camp Pendleton that sunny Tuesday morning, she had no idea she was about to face the most important 12 minutes of her life. 12 minutes that would determine not just her own future, but the fate of 300 Marines who would soon depend on her skills in ways no one could have imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Sarah approached the recruitment center, her portfolio in hand and her heart steady with determination. She had been rejected 12 times, but she was about to discover that sometimes the 13th time isn't just lucky. Sometimes it's destiny. Sarah Chen stood 5 feet 4 inches tall with shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. At 24, she looked even younger, especially in civilian clothes that seemed almost defiant in their simplicity among them. Sea of military uniforms surrounding her. Her Scottish accent, softened by years of international travel but still distinctly European, marked her immediately as an outsider in this distinctly American military environment. As she walked through the corridors of the Marine Corps Recruitment Center, she could feel the weight of curious stares. To the Marines passing by, she looked like someone's younger sister who had gotten lost on base, certainly not someone who belonged in discussions about tactical communications and high-stakes military operations. The reception area buzzed with activity. Young American men and women filled out paperwork, their faces serious with the gravity of military commitment. Sarah took her place among them, but even sitting still, she seemed different. While others nervously shuffled papers or stared straight ahead, Sarah observed everything: the communication systems mounted on the walls, the coordination protocols posted on bulletin boards, the subtle hierarchy evident in how different ranks interacted. This wasn't just casual observation. This was professional assessment. Sarah had trained herself to read environments the way others read books, understanding that in crisis situations, environmental awareness could mean the difference between successful coordination and catastrophic failure. Sarah Chen? The voice cut through the ambient noise like a command. She looked up to see a staff sergeant approaching, his expression neutral, but his body language suggesting this was routine processing rather than anything significant. To him, she was just another applicant to be shuffled through the system. "Colonel Webb will see you now," the sergeant said, gesturing toward a corridor lined with office doors. As they walked, Sarah could hear fragments of conversations from other offices, discussions about deployment schedules, training protocols, equipment requisitions. This was the operational heart of Marine coordination, and despite 12 previous rejections, she felt a familiar surge of excitement. This was where she belonged, where her skills could make a real difference. Colonel Marcus Webb's office reflected 30 years of military service. Commendation plaques covered one wall, while operational maps and communication charts dominated another. Behind his desk, Webb looked like Central Casting's version of a Marine officer: silver hair, steel gray eyes, and shoulders that had carried responsibility for thousands of lives across multiple deployments. He barely looked up as Sarah entered. His attention focused on a stack of reports that seemed to demand immediate attention. The message was clear. This interview was a formality, not a priority. "Miss Chen," he said finally, his tone suggesting he was already mentally moving to the fight. Next item on his schedule: "I've reviewed your application. Impressive academic credentials." There was a pause that seemed to invite Sarah to speak, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She had learned from 12 previous interviews that eager responses were often interpreted as desperation rather than enthusiasm. Webb finally looked up, his eyes taking in her appearance with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to making rapid judgments about personnel. What he saw was a young foreign woman who looked more suited for a university lecture hall than a combat coordination center. "Tell me," Webb continued, leaning back in his chair, "what makes you think you can handle the pressure of military communications? This isn't academic theory." when Marines are under fire and communications are failing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We need specialists who can perform under conditions that would break most people. The question carried an undertone that Sarah had heard 11 times before. It wasn't really about her qualifications. It was about whether she looked like someone who belonged in their world of high-stakes military operations. That Sarah met his gaze directly. "Colonel, pressure doesn't discriminate based on nationality or appearance. When communications fail in hostile territory, what matters isn't who fixes the problem, but whether it gets fixed in time to save lives." Webb's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he was paying closer attention now. "And you believe you can fix problems that our trained military communications specialists cannot?" "I believe," Sarah said carefully, "that my background gives me capabilities that complement traditional military training. When standard protocols fail, you need someone who can think outside established frameworks." It was a diplomatic answer, but Webb heard something else. Confidence that bordered on arrogance from someone who had never proven herself in actual military operations. Have you ever been in a room where you knew you were being underestimated before you even spoke? Share your story in the comments below. The interview was about to take a turn that neither Sarah nor Colonel Webb expected. Outside, the sunny Tuesday morning continued peacefully, but inside that office, the next few minutes would set in motion events that would determine the fate of 300 Marines and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are hiding in plain sight. What Colonel Webb didn't know as he sat across from Sarah Chen was the story behind those impressive academic credentials he had so casually mentioned. Every certificate, every qualification, every skill listed in her file represented a battle fought against a system that had told her repeatedly that she didn't belong. Sarah's journey hadn't begun in comfortable lecture halls or theoretical discussions. It had started in the harsh reality of watching her brother James return from his third deployment to Afghanistan, his hands shaking as he tried to explain how a communication failure had left his unit stranded for 18 hours in hostile territory. 2 of his closest friends died waiting for backup that couldn't find them because their radio equipment had been damaged and their GPS coordinates were lost in a system that had no contingency protocols. That night, as James struggled with nightmares that would follow him for years, Sarah made a promise that would reshape her entire life. She would master every communication system, learn every backup protocol, and develop skills that could prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating loss. While her classmates at university were exploring social activities and casual relationships, Sarah was spending weekends with former Royal Marine communication specialists who taught her field repair techniques for damaged radio equipment. She learned to strip and rebuild communication devices blindfolded, understanding that in combat situations, you might need to repair equipment in complete darkness while under enemy fire. Her linguistic abilities weren't casual academic achievements. They were tools of survival. She spoke fluent Arabic because Middle Eastern deployments required real-time translation of local communications. Her Pashto was learned from Afghan interpreters who had risked their lives supporting British forces. Her French and German came from NATO exercises where communication failures had cost lives because no one could coordinate effectively with allied units. Every summer vacation was spent in the most challenging environments she could find. She worked with mountain rescue teams in the Scottish Highlands, learning how to maintain communication in extreme weather conditions. She volunteered with disaster relief organizations in remote regions of Eastern Europe, mastering the art of establishing communication networks when existing infrastructure had been completely destroyed. Sarah's professors had been impressed by her academic performance, but they couldn't see the deeper motivation driving her relentless pursuit of excellence. This wasn't about career advancement or intellectual curiosity. This was about honoring a promise to her brother and preventing the kind of systematic failures that had haunted her family. Her final year project had caught the attention of several NATO communication specialists. She had designed a revolutionary backup communication protocol that could maintain contact between isolated units using improvised equipment and unconventional signal methods. The system had been tested in simulated combat conditions and had proven effective even when traditional communication infrastructure was completely compromised. But academic success hadn't translated into professional opportunity. The first rejection letter had been polite but clear. "While your qualifications are impressive, we feel you would be better suited for civilian contractor positions that don't require field deployment." The second rejection was more direct. "We're looking for candidates with actual military experience." By the fifth rejection, Sarah began to understand that her qualifications weren't the issue. The issue was that she didn't fit the profile of what military leadership expected from a tactical communications specialist. She was too young, too foreign, and too female for a role that military tradition reserved for battle-tested Marines with years of field experience. Each rejection had stung, but Sarah had learned to channel disappointment into determination. She used the feedback to identify gaps in her experience and then worked to fill them. Told she lacked field experience? She spent 6 months with a private security company providing communication support in conflict zones. Told she didn't understand military culture? She lived on base with British forces for 3 months, learning the unspoken protocols that governed military relationships. What sustained her through 12 rejections was the knowledge that somewhere, at some point, Marines would face the kind of communication crisis that had nearly killed her brother. When that moment came, Sarah wanted to be ready. She wanted to be the specialist who could maintain contact when everything else failed, who could coordinate rescue operations when traditional systems were down, who could be the voice that guided isolated units back to safety. If you've ever felt like you had to work twice as hard just to get half the recognition, drop a heart in the comments. Sarah's story is proof that persistence pays off in ways you never expect. The irony of sitting across from Colonel Webb was that she was probably the most qualified communication specialist the Marines had ever interviewed for this position. Her combination of academic knowledge, practical experience, and specialized training was exactly what they needed for the kind of complex operations they were planning. But qualifications on paper meant nothing if the person reviewing them couldn't see past their own preconceptions about who belonged in their exclusive military world. As Sarah sat in that office, she represented everything the Marine Corps claimed to value: excellence, dedication, and innovative thinking, packaged in a form they weren't prepared to accept. The next few minutes would determine whether 13 years of preparation had been worth the wait, or whether she would become just another name on the long list of talented individuals who were never given the chance to prove their worth. Colonel Webb's office felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted dust particles floating in the air, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the clinical nature of the interview taking place. Every element of the room spoke to military tradition and established hierarchy. The American flag stood prominently in one corner, while framed photographs of previous commanding officers created a visual timeline of leadership dating back decades. The message was unmistakable. This was a place where tradition mattered, where established ways of doing things had proven successful, and where outsiders needed to prove they could fit into existing structures rather than challenging them. Sarah found herself studying the communication equipment visible through the window that overlooked the main coordination center. She could see Marines working at computer terminals, their movements efficient and practiced as they managed routine communications with units across different time zones. It was exactly the kind of environment where her skills could make a difference. But sitting in Webb's office, it felt impossibly distant. The colonel's desk was meticulously organized, with everything positioned at precise angles that suggested a mind comfortable with order and predictability. His pen was aligned perfectly with his notepad, which contained what appeared to be a standardized list of interview questions. This wasn't a conversation designed to discover unique capabilities. It was a process designed to confirm whether an applicant fit predetermined criteria. Behind Webb, a large tactical map showed current Marine deployments across several continents. Red pins marked active operations, while blue pins indicated support bases and communication hubs. Sarah could read the strategic implications of the positioning, understanding how communication networks had to adapt to serve units separated by thousands of miles and multiple time zones. But Webb wasn't asking about strategic communication challenges. Instead, he was reviewing her file with the kind of methodical attention that suggested he was looking for reasons to eliminate her candidacy rather than reasons to advance it. "Miss Chen," he continued, his voice maintaining the same neutral tone that managed to sound both professional and dismissive, "I notice you've applied for specialist positions 12 times in the past 18 months. That's unusual persistence." The comment hung in the air like an accusation. In Webb's experience, candidates who applied repeatedly were usually individuals who couldn't accept that they weren't qualified for the positions they were seeking. Persistence, in his view, often indicated a lack of realistic self-assessment rather than admirable determination. Sarah recognized the subtext. Her multiple applications weren't being interpreted as evidence of commitment. They were being seen as evidence of either desperation or an inability to understand why she wasn't suitable for military service. "I believe," Sarah replied carefully, "that the right opportunity requires the right timing. My qualifications have strengthened with each application." Webb glanced at his notes again, his expression suggesting that he was checking boxes on a mental list rather than engaging with her as an individual candidate. "Your academic background is certainly extensive. University of Edinburgh, specialized training in tactical communications, multiple language certifications. Very impressive for civilian applications." The word civilian carried particular weight in his delivery. It wasn't just a descriptor, it was a category that implied fundamental limitations. No matter how extensive her training or how relevant her skills, she would always be a civilian trying to enter a military world rather than a military professional who belonged in that world by right. The office felt smaller with each passing minute. Sarah could sense the interview following a familiar pattern, polite acknowledgement of her qualifications followed by gentle but firm explanations of why those qualifications didn't translate to suitability for military service. Through the window, she watched a group of Marines conducting a communication drill. Their movements were synchronized and efficient, but Sarah could see inefficiencies in their setup that her training would have helped them avoid. She understood frequency optimization techniques that could improve their signal clarity, backup protocols that could maintain communication even if their primary systems failed, and coordination strategies that could reduce response time by critical seconds. But none of that mattered if she couldn't convince the person across the desk that her foreign accent and civilian background didn't disqualify her from contributing to military operations. Webb's phone buzzed briefly, and he glanced at it with the kind of attention he hadn't given to Sarah's responses. The message, whatever it was, seemed more deserving of his focus than the interview taking place in his office. "Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to be evaluating your potential? Comment below if you've experienced that moment when you realize you're being dismissed before you've even had a chance to prove yourself." The sunny Tuesday morning outside seemed to mock the growing tension inside the office. Somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear the sounds of military training, commands being shouted, equipment being moved, the constant activity of an organization that prided itself on readiness and efficiency. Soon, that same organization would face a crisis that would require exactly the kind of innovative thinking and specialized skills that Sarah had spent years developing. But first, she had to survive the next few minutes of an interview that seemed designed to confirm preconceptions rather than discover potential. Colonel Marcus Webb represented everything that was both admirable and problematic about military leadership. His 30-year career was built on a foundation of genuine accomplishments, successful deployments, lives saved through decisive action, and a track record of leading Marines through some of the most challenging operations of the past 3 decades. His medals weren't decorative. They were earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of split-second decisions that determined whether soldiers came home alive. But success had also bred a dangerous certainty about what worked and what didn't. In Webb's experience, effective military operations required specific types of people with specific backgrounds, following specific protocols. Innovation was valuable when it came from within established military structures, but potentially dangerous when it came from outsiders who didn't understand the life-and-death consequences of military decision-making. As he looked across his desk at Sarah Chen, Webb saw everything his experience had taught him to be skeptical about. She was young in a profession where experience was measured in deployments and near-death situations. She was foreign in an organization that had learned to be cautious about outsiders who might not fully understand American military culture. Most problematically, she was a civilian academic trying to enter a world where theoretical knowledge meant nothing without practical validation under fire. Webb's skepticism wasn't rooted in conscious prejudice. It was based on patterns he had observed throughout his career. The most dangerous mistakes often came from overconfident specialists who believed their academic training qualified them for operational roles they weren't equipped to handle. He had seen communications fail because civilian contractors couldn't adapt their theoretical knowledge to the chaos of actual combat situations. His questions weren't designed to be hostile, but they reflected assumptions about Sarah's limitations that he wasn't even aware he was making. When he looked at her, he didn't see the years of specialized training or the innovative thinking that had impressed NATO communication specialists. He saw a young woman with an accent who had never experienced the specific pressures of military operations. "Miss Chen," Webb continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral, "communication coordination in hostile environments isn't something you can learn from textbooks. When Marines are taking enemy fire and their standard communication equipment has been damaged, they need specialists who can think clearly under pressure that most people can't imagine." The statement carried an implicit assumption that someone with Sarah's background couldn't possibly understand the kind of pressure he was describing. It wasn't that Webb doubted her intelligence or technical skills, but he fundamentally believed that military operations required a specific type of person forged by specific experiences. Webb's office walls were covered with photographs from various deployments, images that showed him alongside Marines in combat zones where split-second decisions determined survival. These weren't just memories. They were credentials that established his authority to judge who was qualified for military service and who wasn't. "I appreciate your enthusiasm for serving," Webb said, his choice of words revealing more than he intended. By calling it enthusiasm, he was categorizing Sarah's career ambitions as emotional rather than professional, temporary excitement rather than serious commitment. What Webb couldn't see was that his very presence represented the system that Sarah had been fighting against for 3 years. Every polite dismissal, every suggestion that she consider civilian contractor positions, every implication that her qualifications were impressive but not quite right. It all stemmed from leaders like Webb, who genuinely believed they were protecting military effectiveness by maintaining traditional standards. The colonel reached for a folder on his desk, his movement suggesting that the interview was approaching its conclusion. Inside that folder were the applications of candidates he considered more suitable, young American men with military academy backgrounds or prior enlisted experience. individuals who fit the profile of successful communication specialists he had worked with throughout his career. Webb prided himself on being fair and thorough in his evaluations, but fairness in his mind meant applying consistent standards to all candidates. He couldn't see that those standards had been designed around assumptions about who belonged in military service, assumptions that automatically excluded people like Sarah, regardless of their actual capabilities. The position we're looking to fill, Webb explained, requires someone who can integrate seamlessly with existing Marine units. Communication specialists need to understand not just the technical aspects of their job, but the cultural dynamics that make military teams effective. Again, the subtext was clear. Sarah, as a foreign civilian, could never truly understand the cultural dynamics that made Marine units effective. Her outsider status wasn't just a minor consideration. It was a fundamental disqualification that no amount of training could overcome. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed determined to find reasons why you weren't qualified, rather than looking for evidence of what you could contribute? Share your experience in the comments below. Webb glanced at his watch, a gesture that suggested his schedule didn't allow for extended discussions with candidates who were unlikely to be selected. In his mind, this interview was a necessary formality, a box to be checked before moving on to more promising candidates. Outside, the sunny Tuesday morning continued its peaceful progression, but inside Webb's office, the collision between established tradition and innovative potential was about to reach a critical moment that would determine not just Sarah's future, but the fate of 300 Marines who would soon desperately need exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that Webb was preparing to dismiss. The air in Colonel Webb's office seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. Sarah could feel the familiar weight of disappointment beginning to settle over her, the same crushing sensation she had experienced 12 times before when interviews that started with cautious optimism slowly transformed into polite rejections. Webb's body language had shifted subtly but unmistakably. His initial professional attention had given way to the kind of detached courtesy that military officers used when dealing with civilians who didn't quite understand their place in the military hierarchy. He was no longer evaluating her potential. He was managing the process of letting her down gently while maintaining the appearance of thorough consideration. "Miss Chen," Webb said, arranging the papers on his desk with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested the interview was nearing its conclusion. "I want you to understand that your qualifications are genuinely impressive. The Marine Corps values technical expertise, and your academic achievements demonstrate the kind of dedication we respect." Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. This was how military rejections always began, with acknowledgement of her qualifications followed by explanations of why those qualifications weren't quite enough. The words were different each time, but the underlying message was always the same. She was impressive for a civilian, but civilian impressive wasn't military ready. However, Webb continued, and Sarah's heart sank as she heard the word that always preceded the real verdict. The specific requirements for this position extend beyond technical knowledge. We need someone who can integrate immediately with existing units, someone who understands military culture at an instinctual level. The colonel's voice remained respectful, even sympathetic, but his words carried the weight of institutional authority. This wasn't personal prejudice. This was professional judgment, based on years of experience managing military operations. In Webb's mind, he was protecting both Sarah and the Marines who would depend on communication specialists by ensuring that only proven candidates were selected for critical positions. Sarah felt the familiar surge of frustration that came with being dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. She wanted to explain that her understanding of military culture came from years of working alongside military personnel in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. She wanted to describe the nights she had spent maintaining communication networks while under fire in conflict zones, The time she had successfully coordinated rescue operations when traditional systems had failed. But she also knew that defending herself too vigorously would only confirm Webb's suspicions that she didn't understand military hierarchy. Civilians who argued with colonels were demonstrating exactly the kind of cultural ignorance that made them unsuitable for military service. Through the window, Sarah could see Marines conducting routine training exercises, their movements efficient and coordinated. She understood the technical aspects of what they were doing better than most of their own communication specialists. But that knowledge felt meaningless sitting across from an officer who had already decided she didn't belong. In their world, Webb glanced at his computer screen, his attention drawn to what appeared to be an urgent message that had just arrived. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, revealing concern about something that clearly took priority over the interview taking place in his office. "I'm sorry," he said, his focus still on the screen. "We've got a developing situation that requires immediate attention." Sarah watched as Webb's entire demeanor changed. The polite but dismissive colonel disappeared, replaced by a combat leader processing urgent information. His eyes moved rapidly across the screen, absorbing details that were clearly alarming enough to override all other considerations. For the first time since entering his office, Sarah saw Colonel Webb as something other than an obstacle to her career ambitions. She saw him as a military leader dealing with real-world crises that had immediate consequences for the Marines under his command. "Colonel," Sarah said quietly, "if there's anything I can help with ... Webb looked up sharply, as if he had forgotten she was still in the room. His expression suggested that the idea of accepting help from a civilian applicant was so foreign it barely registered as a possibility. "Thank you, Miss Chen," he said, his tone making it clear that civilian assistance wasn't required for military problems, but this is a matter for military personnel. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you could help, but no one was willing to give you the chance? Tell us about a time when your potential was overlooked in the comments below. The urgent message on Webb's screen was about to change everything. But in that moment, neither he nor Sarah understood how dramatically their lives were about to intersect. The sunny Tuesday morning that had started with a routine interview was about to become the day when institutional prejudice collided with life-and-death reality. Sarah remained seated, sensing that something significant was happening but unable to determine what role, if any, she might play in the crisis that was clearly unfolding. The weight of 13 rejections pressed down on her, but somewhere deep inside, she felt a familiar stirring of readiness, the same readiness that had sustained her through years of preparation for a moment that might never come. That moment was about to arrive in ways that neither Sarah nor Colonel Webb could have imagined. Colonel Webb's attention snapped back to Sarah with the kind of focus that suggested his patience for civilian interruptions had reached its limit. The urgent message on his screen had clearly escalated beyond routine military business, and the last thing he needed was a rejected applicant attempting to insert herself into operational matters. "Miss Chen," Webb said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of military authority that ended discussions rather than encouraging them, "I think we've covered everything we need to discuss today. Your qualifications are impressive, but they're not aligned with our current operational requirements." The words landed with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. This wasn't a postponement or a request for additional information. This was a rejection, clear and definitive. Sarah felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but something about Webb's urgency and the obvious crisis developing on his computer screen made this rejection feel different from the previous 12. Webb stood up from his desk, his body language indicating that the interview was officially concluded. He moved with the kind of purposeful energy that came from years of managing military crises, but Sarah could see tension in his shoulders that suggested this particular situation was more serious than routine operational challenges. I want to be completely transparent with you, Webb continued, his tone softening slightly as he attempted to cushion the rejection with explanation. The Marine Corps needs communication specialists who can integrate immediately with existing teams. Your academic background is excellent, but field operations require a different kind of expertise. Sarah remained seated, recognizing that standing up would signal acceptance of the dismissal. She had learned from previous rejections that the moment you accepted defeat was the moment opportunity disappeared forever. Something about the crisis unfolding on Webb's computer screen told her that this might be her last chance to prove that academic excellence could translate into operational value. "Colonel," Sarah said carefully, "what kind of communication challenge are you dealing with?" Webb's expression hardened immediately. The question crossed a line that civilian applicants weren't supposed to approach. Military operations weren't topics for discussion with outsiders, especially outsiders who had just been told they weren't qualified for military service. "That's classified information, Miss Chen," Webb replied sharply. "And it illustrates exactly why civilian specialists aren't suitable for these positions. Military operations require security clearances and established protocols that protect sensitive information." The rebuke was designed to end the conversation definitively, but Sarah could see past Webb's protective instincts to the genuine concern driving his urgency. Whatever was happening wasn't a routine communication problem. It was something serious enough to override all other considerations, including the basic courtesy of properly concluding their interview. Webb moved toward his office door, his intention clear. The interview was over, and Sarah needed to leave so he could focus on military matters that actually required his attention. But as he reached for the door handle, his phone rang with the kind of urgent tone that indicated emergency priority. "Colonel Webb," he answered, his voice immediately shifting into crisis management mode. Sarah couldn't hear the details of the conversation, but she could read Webb's expression as it shifted from concern to alarm to something approaching desperation. Whatever information he was receiving was clearly beyond the scope of routine military challenges. "How many?" Webb asked, his voice tight with controlled tension. "And we've lost all contact?" The phrase "lost all contact" sent a chill through Sarah's professionally trained instincts. In her specialized field, lost contact meant isolated units, endangered personnel, and the kind of communication failures that could transform routine operations into life-and-death crises. Webb's conversation continued in the clipped, efficient language of military crisis management, but Sarah could hear the underlying strain that came from dealing with problems that exceeded available solutions. Whatever was happening was serious enough to require immediate action, but complex enough to challenge existing military resources. "Sir," Webb said into the phone, "we need to consider all available options. The standard protocols aren't working." As he spoke, Webb's eyes briefly met Sarah's, and for just a moment, she saw past the colonel's professional authority to the human being struggling with a crisis that threatened lives under his command. It was the same expression she had seen on her brother's face when he talked about watching friends die because communication systems had failed at critical moments. Have you ever been dismissed from a conversation where you knew you could help solve the exact problem being discussed? Share your experience in the comments below. Webb ended the phone call and stood silent for a moment, his military bearing unable to completely mask the weight of whatever decision he was facing. Sarah could see him mentally cycling through options, evaluating resources, and confronting the possibility that traditional solutions might not be sufficient for the crisis at hand. The sunny Tuesday morning outside seemed increasingly distant from the tension building inside Webb's office. Somewhere, Marines were facing the kind of communication crisis that Sarah had spent years learning to solve. But she was about to be escorted out of the building by a system that valued institutional credentials over actual capability. The next few minutes would determine whether bureaucratic prejudice would triumph over operational necessity. or whether crisis would create the opportunity Sarah had been waiting for since her brother came home broken from Afghanistan. Colonel Webb's phone call had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it had fundamentally altered the atmosphere in his office. When he hung up, his face carried the kind of grave expression that Sarah had learned to recognize during her time working with emergency response teams, the look of someone confronting a situation where standard procedures had failed and creative solutions were desperately needed. "Miss Chen," Webb said, his voice now carrying urgent dismissal rather than polite rejection, "I need you to leave immediately. We have a developing operational crisis that requires all available military personnel." But instead of moving toward the door, Sarah remained seated, her professional instincts overriding social protocol. Everything about Webb's phone conversation had triggered alarm bells, developed through years of emergency response training. The phrases she had overheard, "lost all contact," "standard protocols aren't working," "consider all available options," painted a picture of exactly the kind of communication crisis she had spent her entire career preparing to handle. "Colonel," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room, "how many Marines have you lost contact with?" Webb's expression shifted from urgent dismissal to genuine anger. The question wasn't just inappropriate, it was a direct challenge to military authority from someone who had no right to information about ongoing operations. "That information is classified," Webb snapped, his military bearing now fully engaged in protective mode. "And your insistence on pursuing classified information demonstrates exactly why civilian specialists aren't suitable for military operations." Moved toward his office door with clear intention to summon someone to escort Sarah from the building, but his phone rang again before he could complete the action. The urgency of the ringtone suggested that whatever crisis was unfolding was escalating rapidly. "Webb here," he answered, his voice tight with controlled stress. Sarah watched as Webb's expression grew increasingly grave during the brief conversation. She could only hear fragments, no response from any unit. "Terrain is blocking all standard signals. We're running out of options." But those fragments painted a clear picture of a communication catastrophe that was endangering Marine lives. When Webb ended the second call, his professional composure was showing visible cracks. This wasn't just a routine communication problem that could be solved through standard military procedures. This was evolving into the kind of crisis that would require innovative thinking and unconventional solutions. "Colonel," Sarah said, standing up but not moving toward the door, "I can help." The simple statement landed in the room like a hand grenade. Webb turned toward her with an expression that mixed disbelief with outrage. The idea that a civilian applicant who had just been rejected from military service would offer to help with a classified military crisis was so presumptuous, it seemed to mock everything Webb understood about military hierarchy and security protocols. "Miss Chen," Webb said, his voice now carrying the kind of cold authority that ended military careers, "you need to understand something very clearly. This is a military operation involving classified information and personnel under enemy fire. Your suggestion that you can help reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of military security and operational protocols." Webb's rejection wasn't just professional, it was personal. Sarah's persistence in the face of clear dismissal was challenging not just his decision-making authority, but his understanding of appropriate civilian behavior in military environments. In his experience, civilians who couldn't accept rejection gracefully were exactly the kind of people who created problems in high-stress military situations. "Furthermore," Webb continued, his tone growing more formal as he shifted into official reprimand mode, "your insistence on pursuing classified information after being explicitly told it was classified raises serious questions about your understanding of military security requirements." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Webb was implying that her professional interest in helping solve a communication crisis was actually a security breach. evidence that she couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. It was the kind of character assassination that could follow her through future applications, marking her permanently as someone who didn't respect military authority. Sarah felt the familiar rage that came from being dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities, but this time the stakes were higher than her personal career aspirations. Somewhere Marines were in danger because of communication failures, and the person responsible for helping them was more concerned with maintaining institutional hierarchy than exploring all available solutions. "Colonel," Sarah said, her voice carrying the edge of determination that matched Webb's authority, "300 Marines are going to die if you don't let me help." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything Webb believed about military operations and civilian limitations. Sarah had crossed every line of appropriate civilian behavior, challenging his authority, demanding access to classified information, and now making dramatic predictions about military casualties. Have you ever been in a situation where following the rules meant watching a preventable disaster unfold? Tell us about a time when you had to choose between protocol and doing what was right. Webb's office felt smaller with each passing second. Outside, the sunny Tuesday morning continued peacefully, but inside that room, institutional prejudice was colliding with operational necessity in ways that would determine whether Sarah's years of preparation would finally find their purpose, or whether bureaucratic resistance would cost 300 Marines their lives. Colonel Webb's patience had reached its absolute limit. Sarah's declaration that 300 Marines would die unless he accepted her help crossed every boundary of appropriate civilian behavior and challenged the fundamental authority structure that governed military operations. This was no longer about a rejected job application. This was about a civilian who either didn't understand or didn't respect the basic principles of military hierarchy and security. "Sergeant Morrison," Webb called sharply toward his office door, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that brought immediate response. Within seconds, Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared in the doorway, his expression alert and ready for whatever task the colonel required. Morrison was exactly the kind of Marine that Webb valued: experienced, disciplined, and completely reliable in following orders without questioning authority. "Sergeant," Webb said, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding, "Miss Chen needs to be escorted from the building immediately. She's been briefed on the classified nature of our current operations and needs to understand that civilian interference in military matters is not acceptable." Sarah felt the familiar humiliation of public dismissal, but this time it carried additional weight. Webb wasn't just rejecting her application. He was publicly branding her as someone who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information, someone who represented a security risk rather than a potential asset. Morrison stepped into the office, his bearing professional but his expression suggesting that escorting rejected civilian applicants was a routine part of his duties. To him, Sarah was just another person who had overestimated her suitability for military service and needed to be removed before creating further disruption. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his tone respectful but firm, "I'll need you to come with me." But before Sarah could respond, Webb's phone rang again with the urgent tone that had been interrupting their conversation all morning. This time, however, Webb's expression as he listened to the caller suggested that whatever news he was receiving was even more alarming than the previous updates. "What do you mean we've lost contact with the rescue team too?" Webb asked, his voice tight with barely controlled stress. Sarah's professional instincts went into overdrive. The phrase, "lost contact with the rescue team," indicated that the original communication crisis had escalated beyond isolated units to include the personnel sent to help them. This was exactly the kind of cascading failure that turned routine operations into catastrophic disasters. Morrison remained at attention, waiting for Webb to complete his phone call before executing the order to remove Sarah from the building. But Sarah could see that the sergeant was also listening to fragments of the conversation, his expression growing more concerned as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. "Sir," Webb said into the phone, "we need to consider that. Our standard communication protocols aren't adequate for the terrain and conditions. The equipment failures seem to be systematic rather than isolated incidents." Sarah recognized the moment when military leadership confronted the limitations of conventional thinking. Webb was beginning to acknowledge that the crisis required solutions that existed outside established military procedures, but his institutional training prevented him from considering that those solutions might come from civilian sources. "Colonel," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, "the terrain you're describing sounds like it requires frequency modulation techniques that aren't part of standard military training." Webb lowered his phone and stared at Sarah with an expression that mixed disbelief with outrage. She had not only refused to leave when ordered, but had continued to insert herself into classified military discussions despite being explicitly told that such behavior was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. "Sergeant Morrison," Webb said, his voice now carrying cold fury, "Miss Chen has repeatedly attempted to access classified information despite being told such access is restricted to military personnel. Please ensure she understands the seriousness of her behavior." Morrison stepped forward, his professional demeanor masking what Sarah recognized as genuine sympathy for her situation. She could see in his eyes that he understood she was trying to help, but military discipline required him to follow orders, regardless of personal feelings. "Ma'am," Morrison said gently, "I really do need you to come with me now." Sarah felt the weight of 13 rejections pressing down on her, the accumulated humiliation of years spent being told she didn't belong in the world where her skills were most needed. But she also felt something else, the certainty that came from recognizing a crisis that matched her exact area of expertise. Have you ever been removed from a situation where you knew you were the only person who could solve the problem? Share your story of being silenced when your voice was most needed. "Sergeant," Sarah said, looking directly at Morrison while speaking loudly enough for Webb to hear, "in 30 minutes you're going to wish someone had listened to me." The prediction carried the weight of professional certainty rather than emotional desperation. Sarah wasn't making a threat or expressing hope. She was stating a fact based on her analysis of the communication crisis Webb was facing. Morrison hesitated for just a moment, his military training warring with instincts that suggested Sarah might know something important. But orders were orders, and questioning Colonel's decisions wasn't part of his job description. As Morrison gently but firmly guided Sarah toward the door, Webb's phone rang again with the urgent tone that had been marking the progression of the crisis all morning. The sunny Tuesday that had started with a routine interview was about to become the day when institutional prejudice collided with life and death reality in ways that no one in that room could have imagined. As Staff Sergeant Morrison guided Sarah toward the office door, Colonel Webb's phone erupted with the kind of emergency alert that every military commander dreaded. The sound cut through the tension in the room like a blade, immediately transforming the atmosphere from administrative dismissal to life and death crisis management. Webb answered the call with sharp urgency, his entire demeanor shifting into combat leadership mode. "Webb here. What's the situation?" Sarah could hear the caller's voice through the phone speaker, distorted but unmistakably panicked. "Colonel, we've lost all contact with Firebase Delta. 300 Marines, sir. Complete communication blackout for the past 47 minutes. The words hit the room like a physical force. Morrison's grip on Sarah's arm loosened involuntarily as the implications of what they were hearing began to register. This wasn't just a routine communication problem. This was exactly the kind of catastrophic system failure that Sarah had been warning about. "What about backup communication protocols?" Webb demanded, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "Sir, we've tried everything." Standard radio frequencies, satellite communication, emergency beacons, nothing is getting through. The terrain is creating a perfect communication dead zone, and something is interfering with all our standard equipment. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as professional recognition kicked in. The description matched exactly the kind of complex communication failure she had spent years learning to solve. Multiple system failures, combined with terrain interference that required innovative frequency modulation and unconventional signal routing. Webb's face had gone pale as he processed the magnitude of the crisis. 300 Marines in a communication dead zone meant 300 Marines who couldn't call for backup, couldn't report their status, and couldn't coordinate with support units if they came under attack. "Sir," the voice on the phone continued, "we need solutions fast. Intelligence suggests hostile forces are moving toward Firebase Delta's position. If we can't establish communication within the next hour, we're looking at a massacre." The word massacre hung in the air like a death sentence. Morrison had stopped moving entirely, his military discipline warring with the growing realization that they were witnessing a crisis that exceeded standard military capabilities. Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the command authority that had been dismissing her all morning. "Colonel, I can solve this." Webb looked at her with an expression that mixed desperation with disbelief. Everything in his military training told him that classified operations couldn't be shared with civilian contractors, but everything in his leadership experience told him that 300 Marines were about to die unless someone found a solution that standard military procedures couldn't provide. "The terrain you're describing creates specific frequency interference patterns," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the calm authority of technical expertise. "Standard military communication equipment isn't designed to handle the kind of signal routing required for that environment, but I've developed protocols that can maintain contact using improvised equipment and unconventional frequency modulation." Webb's phone rang again, and the voice that came through the speaker carried even more urgency. "Colonel, we're getting reports of enemy movement. Firebase Delta has maybe 2 hours before they're completely surrounded. We need communication now." The timeline was collapsing. 2 hours to establish contact, coordinate rescue operations, and extract 300 Marines from a position that was about to become a death trap. Webb looked at Sarah, then at Morrison, then back at the phone that was delivering increasingly desperate updates. "Miss Chen," Webb said, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and institutional resistance, "what you're suggesting would require security clearances, classified access, and authorization levels that could take weeks to process." "Colonel," Sarah replied, her tone matching his urgency, "those 300 Marines don't have weeks, they have hours." Morrison cleared his throat, his voice carefully respectful but determined. "Sir, if Miss Chun can help, maybe we should consider." "Sergeant," Webb interrupted sharply, "you're not qualified to make recommendations about classified operations." But even as Webb asserted his authority, Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. His military training demanded adherence to security protocols, but his leadership responsibility demanded that he explore every possible option to save the Marines under his command. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and she glanced at it quickly before looking back at Webb. "Colonel, I just received a priority message from NATO Communication Command. They're tracking this situation and recommending that Marine leadership consider all available specialist resources." Have you ever been in a situation where following the rules meant watching people die? Comment below if you've faced a moment when protocol and conscience collided. Webb stared at Sarah, his certainty crumbling as the weight of 300 lives pressed against years of institutional training. The sunny Tuesday morning that had started with a routine interview had become the moment when Colonel Marcus Webb would have to choose between military protocol and Marine survival. The phone in his hand continued to buzz with incoming updates, each one more urgent than the last. Time was running out, and the decision he made in the next 60 seconds would determine whether Sarah Chen would finally get her chance to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly the ones you need. Colonel Webb stood frozen in a moment that would define his entire career. 300 Marines were trapped in a communication dead zone with hostile forces closing in, and the only person offering a solution was a civilian applicant he had just dismissed as unqualified for military service. Every protocol, every regulation, every lesson learned through 30 years of military leadership told him that sharing classified, operational details with unauthorized personnel was a career-ending mistake, but the phone in his hand continued to deliver increasingly desperate updates that painted a picture of impending catastrophe. "Colonel," the voice crackled through the speaker, "enemy forces are estimated to reach Firebase Delta's perimeter in 90 minutes. Without communication, we can't coordinate air support, medical evacuation, or tactical repositioning. Sir, we're out of options." Sarah watched Webb's internal struggle with the clinical observation of someone who understood the weight of impossible decisions. She had seen the same expression on emergency coordinators who faced disasters that exceeded their training. The moment when leadership had to choose between following established procedures and improvising solutions that might save lives. "Colonel," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room, "I need you to understand something. The communication failure you're describing isn't random. The terrain around Firebase Delta creates a natural frequency funnel that amplifies certain signals while completely blocking others. Standard military equipment isn't designed to navigate that kind of interference pattern." Webb looked up from his phone, his expression caught between hope and skepticism. "How could you possibly know the terrain around Firebase Delta?" "Because," Sarah replied, pulling out her tablet and quickly accessing a file she had studied extensively. "I've been tracking communication challenges in that exact region for 18 months. NATO intelligence identified it as a potential operational weakness, and I developed specialized protocols specifically for maintaining contact in that kind of environment." She turned the tablet toward Webb, displaying detailed topographical maps overlaid with frequency analysis charts that showed exactly how the terrain would interfere with standard communication equipment. The level of detail and technical sophistication was immediately apparent. This wasn't theoretical academic work, but practical operational planning. Morrison stepped closer, his eyes widening as he recognized the military precision of Sarah's analysis. "Sir," he said quietly, "this looks like exactly what we need." Webb's phone buzzed again with another urgent update. "Colonel, Firebase Delta's last known position puts them directly in the path of a major enemy offensive. If we can't establish communication in the next hour, we'll have to assume they've been overrun." The timeline was accelerating beyond anyone's control. Webb looked at Sarah's analysis, then at the phone delivering increasingly dire updates, then back at Sarah herself. For the first time since she had entered his office, he was seeing her not as an inappropriate civilian applicant, but as a potential solution to a crisis that was rapidly exceeding his available resources. "Miss Chen," Webb said, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and authority, "if I were to hypothetically consider your assistance, what would you need?" Sarah's heart raced as she recognized the shift in Webb's tone. This wasn't acceptance yet, but it was the first crack in the institutional resistance that had been blocking her for 3 years. "I need access to your main communication center, authorization to modify existing equipment, and permission to implement unconventional frequency protocols." "That's impossible," Webb replied automatically. "You don't have security clearance. For the communication center and modifying military equipment requires." His phone interrupted with another urgent call. "Colonel, we've lost contact with the rescue team too. Whatever's causing the communication blackout is spreading. We now have 400 Marines in the dead zone. 400 Marines." The number hit the room like a physical blow. What had Started as a serious communication problem, had escalated into a potential military disaster that could become one of the worst Marine casualties in decades. Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through Webb's obvious internal conflict. "Colonel, in 15 minutes, I can establish a communication link that will not only reach Firebase Delta, but provide a stable backup network that can't be disrupted by terrain interference. But I need your authorization now." Webb stared at her, his military training warring with the increasingly desperate reality of the situation. Every instinct told him that unauthorized civilians in military communication centers was a security nightmare, but every update from the field told him that standard procedures were failing catastrophically. Morrison cleared his throat, his voice carefully respectful but determined. "Sir, Miss Chen's analysis matches exactly what we're seeing in the field. Maybe we need to consider non-standard solutions. Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between following rules and saving lives? Share your thoughts on when protocol should be overridden in the comments below." Webb looked at his watch, calculating rapidly. 90 minutes until enemy forces reached Firebase Delta. 400 Marines, whose lives depended on decisions made in the next few minutes. A civilian specialist offering solutions that his own communication experts couldn't provide. The sunny Tuesday morning outside seemed to mock the life-and-death drama unfolding in Webb's office. In 60 seconds, he would make the decision that would either save 400 Marine lives or end his own military career in disgrace. Colonel Webb's decision came with the swift certainty of a combat leader who had learned to trust his instincts when conventional wisdom failed. "Sergeant Morrison," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "Escort Miss Chen to Communication Center Alpha. Full access, immediate authorization." Morrison's eyes widened slightly, but his military discipline kicked in immediately. "Yes, sir. What about security protocols?" "I'm taking full responsibility," Webb replied, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Miss Chen, you have 20 minutes to prove that civilian expertise can accomplish what military training cannot." As they rushed through the corridors of the Marine base, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline that came from finally being given the opportunity she had spent 3 years fighting for. But beneath the excitement was the sobering weight of responsibility. 400 Marine lives now depended on her ability to deliver on promises she had been making since her brother returned broken from Afghanistan. The communication center Alpha buzzed with urgent activity. Marines worked frantically at computer terminals, their faces tense with the kind of focused desperation that came from dealing with a crisis that exceeded their training. Radio static filled the air as communication specialists attempted increasingly desperate methods to establish contact with the isolated forces. "Ma'am," Morrison said as they entered the center, "what do you need?" Sarah's eyes swept across the sophisticated military communication equipment, immediately identifying the modifications required to implement her specialized protocols. "I need access to the main frequency modulation system and authorization to reconfigure the signal routing protocols." A staff sergeant working at the primary communication terminal looked up with obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, with respect, those systems require specialized military training. Civilian modifications could compromise our entire communication network." Sarah understood the concern, but she also understood that 400 Marines didn't have time for institutional hesitation. "Sergeant, the current system is already compromised. What I'm proposing will either solve the problem or fail in ways that don't make the situation worse." She moved to the main terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario for years. The other Marines watched with a mixture of curiosity and alarm as she began implementing frequency modulation techniques that existed outside standard military protocols. "Miss Chen," Morrison said, his voice tight with concern, "Colonel Webb is monitoring this operation personally. If this doesn't work, "It will work," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of technical expertise validated by years of field experience. The terrain around Firebase Delta creates specific interference patterns that require unconventional signal routing. Standard military equipment isn't designed for this kind of challenge. As Sarah worked, the communication center gradually fell, silent except for the sound of her modifications being implemented. Even the skeptical staff sergeant found himself drawn to her screen, watching as she constructed a communication network that used principles he had never encountered in military training. "There," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension as she completed the final configuration. Attempting contact with Firebase Delta now. The room held its collective breath as Sarah activated the modified communication system. For several seconds, nothing happened except the familiar static that had been mocking their efforts all morning. Then, faintly but unmistakably, a voice crackled through the speakers. "Firebase Delta to command. Firebase Delta to command. Do you copy?" The communication center erupted in cheers and relieved exclamations. After hours of complete communication blackout, they had re-established contact with the isolated Marines. But Sarah wasn't celebrating yet. Contact was only the first step in coordinating a successful rescue operation. "Firebase Delta, this is command," Morrison responded, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "What's your status?" "Command, we have visual confirmation of hostile forces approaching from 3 directions. Estimate enemy contact in approximately 45 minutes. We need immediate air support and medical evacuation for wounded personnel." Sarah's modifications had worked perfectly, providing not just basic communication, but clear, reliable contact that could support complex coordination operations. She continued working at the terminal, establishing backup channels and implementing redundant systems that would maintain contact even if primary equipment failed. Colonel Webb's voice came through the communication center's intercom system. "Miss Chen, this is outstanding work. What's the status on expanded coverage for the rescue teams?" "Colonel," Sarah replied, her confidence growing as her system proved its effectiveness, "I can provide stable communication coverage for the entire operational area. The rescue teams will have full coordination capability." Have you ever had a moment when years of preparation suddenly paid off in ways you never expected? Share your breakthrough moment in the comments below. The staff sergeant, who had questioned Sarah's qualifications, approached her terminal. His expression transformed from skepticism to genuine respect. "Ma'am, how did you know this would work?" Sarah looked up from her screen, where multiple communication channels now showed stable connections with all Marine units in the operational area. "Because," she said simply, "I've been preparing for this exact scenario for 3 years." As coordinate rescue operations began flowing through her communication network, Sarah realized that her 13 rejections hadn't been failures. They had been preparation for this moment when her unconventional skills would prove essential for saving 400 Marine lives. 6 hours later, as the last helicopter touched down at Camp Pendleton carrying the final evacuated Marines from Firebase Delta, Colonel Webb stood in Communication Center Alpha watching Sarah coordinate the complex operation that had saved 400 lives. Her modified communication system had not only maintained contact throughout the rescue, but had provided coordination capabilities that exceeded anything the Marines had previously achieved in similar operations. The numbers told the story of an unqualified success. 400 Marines extracted from hostile territory with 0 casualties, enemy forces outmaneuvered through superior coordination, and a communication network that had functioned flawlessly under conditions that had defeated standard military equipment. But the real story was more complex than tactical success. It was about the cost of institutional prejudice and the value of recognizing excellence regardless of its source. "Miss Chen," Webb said, approaching her terminal as she completed the final status reports, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond this operation." Sarah looked up from her screen, her expression showing exhaustion mixed with quiet satisfaction. The adrenaline of crisis management was wearing off, leaving behind the deeper fulfillment that came from using her skills exactly as she had always intended. "Colonel," she replied, "you don't owe me an apology. You made decisions based on your experience and training. What matters is that you were willing to change those decisions when circumstances required it." Webb shook his head, his expression carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "No, Miss Chen. What I owe you is recognition that my experience and training had created blind spots that nearly cost 400 Marine lives. Your 13th application wasn't just another rejection I needed to process. It was an opportunity I almost missed because I couldn't see past my own assumptions." The communication center around them was returning to normal operations, but the impact of the day's events would resonate far beyond routine military activities. Every Marine who had witnessed Sarah's technical expertise understood that capability couldn't be measured by traditional credentials, and every officer who had tracked the operation recognized that innovation often came from unexpected sources. Morrison approached, carrying official paperwork that represented the bureaucratic aftermath of the day's crisis. "Sir, Miss Chun's security clearance has been expedited through emergency authorization. NATO Communication Command is requesting immediate consultation on implementing her protocols across all allied operations." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and responsibility as the reality of her new position began to settle. The years of rejection and dismissal had ended not with bitter triumph, but with the sobering understanding that her skills came with obligations to the Marines who would depend on them. "Miss Chen," Webb continued, "I want you to understand something important. The decision to override security protocols and grant you access to classified operations wasn't just about solving today's crisis. It was about recognizing that the Marine Corps needs people who can think beyond our established frameworks." Sarah nodded, understanding that Webb's acknowledgement represented more than personal recognition. It represented institutional change that could create opportunities for other unconventional candidates who might otherwise be dismissed based on appearance rather than capability. Webb's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and he glanced at it before answering. Colonel Webb speaking. Sarah could hear fragments of the conversation: congratulations from senior command, requests for detailed reports on the communication innovations, and discussions about implementing her protocols as standard procedures for similar operations. The success of the Firebase Delta rescue was already generating interest at the highest levels of military leadership. "Sarah," Webb said after ending the call, using her first name for the first time since they had met, "General Martinez wants to discuss establishing a new position in tactical communications that would utilize exactly the kind of unconventional thinking you demonstrated today." The offer represented everything Sarah had been working toward for 3 years, but it also carried the weight of responsibility for ensuring that her success opened doors for others who might face similar institutional resistance. "Colonel," Sarah said, "I accept with one condition. I want to help establish evaluation protocols that assess capability based on demonstrated expertise rather than traditional credentials." Webb smiled, recognizing that Sarah's condition represented exactly the kind of systemic thinking that had made her successful in crisis management. "Agreed. The Marine Corps benefits when we expand our definition of what qualified service looks like." As the sunny Tuesday afternoon drew to a close, Sarah Chen reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 13 applications, 12 rejections, and 1 opportunity had taught her that persistence wasn't about enduring failure, it was about being ready when circumstances finally aligned with capability. Have you ever had a moment when everything you had worked for suddenly came together in ways you never expected? Share your story of persistence paying off in the comments below. The Firebase Delta rescue would become a case study in innovative military communication, But for Sarah, it represented something simpler and more profound, proof that her brother's sacrifice had meaning, and that her promise to prevent other families from experiencing similar loss could actually be fulfilled. Outside, the California sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, marking the end of the day when institutional prejudice had finally yielded to operational necessity, and Sarah Chen had transformed from a rejected applicant into the communication specialist who saved 400 Marine lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.